let's just speak briefly about Romans. The recipients, again, this is important. This is another. Let me say this, and again, this is the reason why I keep on using the word important. Dr. Bob, in the seminar of You Can Understand the Bible, he teaches a 7-step or 7 questions that you must process, that you go through to interpret the Bible. And one of the main attractive things that I have said in the past when it comes to this methodology, because it's only a methodology, it's a method on how to interpret the Bible that Dr. Bob teaches, is that he forces the reader, he forces the interpreter not to begin with you. And I'm saying with you because what you don't want to do is to approach any document, the Bible and any other book, with you as the focal, with you and your circumstances as the lenses on how you process what you're trying to read. And if the goal is to get the message of what God has said. Now, I don't believe that you're wrong by doing devotional reading. And by devotional reading is when you open the Bible and you read a passage, seeking, looking, praying for God to speak to you. I don't think you're wrong with that. And whatever God speaks to you, you're responsible and accountable. But if you're going to speak on behalf of God and you want to try to make others accountable or responsible from listening to you, then you cannot begin with you. You must begin with the author. Now, with that being said, in devotional reading, personal reading, morning reading of the Bible, whatever, at night, whatever you do, my invitation, this is my suggestion, is that you base your devotional reading on what the author understood, not on what you understand, just for your sake, for your guard, for your own protection. So in that way, when you hear God's voice, you want to make sure that you're hearing what the Bible says, not what you want the Bible to say to you. Because that's when you get into trouble. Potentially, you can get into confusion and you can deviate from the message of God. Now, with that being said, this is why I'm bringing this up. Look at the screen and you see the recipients. This is the people that the Bible or the book was written to. Dr. Bob made reference last week that these books in the New Testament and some of the Old Testament as well, they are occasional letters, occasional books, meaning that something triggers, something happened, there is an event or a series of events that brings or creates, or I don't want to use the word forces, but brings the author to write these letters. So on the 7th step that Dr. Bob introduces in the seminar of You Can Understand the Bible, the very last 2 have to do with the reader, with the interpreter, with you and I as readers. But the first 5 has nothing to do with us. It begins with author, what the author said, what the author meant, what the author said in other books or in other passages of the same topic, what other authors said about the same topic. So I'm going, if you picture concentric circles, is open it up from the author to the meaning of the words of the author to what the author said in other settings or in other passages. If, like in Paul, that he wrote 13 books, you want to move up into the parallelism, and then eventually you get, which is number 5, you get to this section that you have in front of you, the recipients. The number 5 of the questions and the steps is what the recipients, understood, and what they, how they applied the message that either Paul, in this case, Paul is writing. So we understand historically that the destination, again, you see it on the screen. On the screen is basically Rome, and it gives you all these details of what is happening. And again, last week, Dr. Bob made reference, especially to this section right here, how in his plans for Paul, it was to visit Spain. And apparently, he is introducing the gospel and explaining the gospel in a manner to the church in Rome to show them that as he goes into Spain and continue to take the gospel to the world, his gospel is reliable. His gospel is the truth. And that's why Romans is such a massive, compilation of doctrinal statements. And this is where I will also suggest, I'm just going to step right here to the brief outline. The outline is so crucial because one of the things that we will learn on that course of biblical interpretation is that words have meaning only in sentences. Sentences have meaning only in paragraphs, and paragraphs have meaning in literary units. So what you see here, what he has done on this outline is simply breaking down the book through those literary units, those paragraphs, and eventually those sentences, and then you get to the verses. But that's what you see in there. So anyway, so keep that in mind, especially with the recipients. Who did he write to? And the book of Romans has a very unique set of context on who is he writing to, under what conditions is he writing to, what's the theological views or the lenses of these people that he's writing to. So when you read Romans, you have to keep those things in mind. You have to remind yourself, okay, who is he writing to? And then here is the other challenge. Or the invitation. Once you know who the recipients are, then you have to make an effort to try to process what you're reading through the lenses of the recipients, and ask yourself this question: how is it that they would have understood what Paul is writing? Because unless you go through these 5 steps, I don't think you're able, or I shouldn't be moving towards what does that mean in my context, in a pandemia, now that my son fill in the blank and my mama is fill in the blank, whatever circumstances you may be going to, those are legit circumstances. But what you don't want to do is go through life, as a young person, as an elderly person, as a single person, whatever you are. What you don't want to do is go through life and then go to the Bible and trying to find a verse that validates whatever you're going in life. You want to do the opposite. You want to go to the Bible, and whatever is going on in your life, you want to make sure that your life and my life submits to what the Bible says on whatever the topic may be. That's what you want to do. Is it easy to do? No, it's not. The tendency is to do the opposite. The tendency is to go and find verses that, agree with me, support my views, my theology, and things like that. Now, all that to say, the section that I have invited you to consider is the purpose. And I think this is the central idea of the book, the purpose of the book. And Dr. Bob, he presents this section in every single one of his introductions. So let's just spend some time on this. An appeal for help. This is the purpose. This is why he wrote the letter. An appeal for help from the church in Rome for his missionary trip to Spain. So again, he is on his way to Spain. Paul saw his apostolic work in the Eastern Mediterranean finished, and then he's using the references, which this is what you may call internal evidences, to support this statement that he's done, doing his work in that area. So he wants to go to Spain. That's letter A. That's one of the reasons he's appealing. He is requesting. He is bringing. So he's making this official request to the church in Rome. Letter B. Another purpose is to address the problem. There's the addressing of a problem in the Roman church between believing Jews and believing Gentiles. So one of the things that we typically do, and I think this is part of our tendency on the 7 steps or 7 questions of biblical interpretation that he introduces, we are constantly pulling back. I think we all do this. And instead of beginning with the author and what he meant and what he said in other passages and all that, we typically come back to us. We typically try to make the Bible about us, and not just the Bible, but life. Tragically, this last week, what is his name? The guy from Black Panther, the author, the actor, age 41, 42, something, he died. So when you think about the movie Black Panther, this brother was the main character. In the Bible, we are not Black Panther. We are not the main character. The Bible is about Jesus. It's not about us. So in biblical interpretation, This is why we go through the 7 steps. If you and I continue to make ourselves the Black Panther, the main character of life, again, we're setting ourselves up for failure in that regard, because that's exactly what the nation of Israel did in the Old Testament. That's exactly making themselves the point. That's exactly what the church in the first century did. And the concept, the understanding of the priesthood of believers, that is well known among churches. We typically and tragically 500 years ago with the Reform, Martin Luther, that's exactly what he fought. He fought a system that the church made themselves the center of all this. And they put themselves about the scriptures, when the scriptures is not even about the church. It's about the husband, the groom of the church, which is Jesus Christ. So the understanding of the doctrine of priesthood of the believer is actually about global evangelism, which is exactly why Abraham was chosen, predestined, and then his children, his family, and eventually a nation. They were chosen by God for global evangelism. So that's the reminder that we cannot begin with ourselves, that salvation is not just from hell, but salvation is primarily from God, his judgment, his wrath, his vengeance, but also salvation is from self. And I think through this methodology of biblical interpretation, it's crucial that we build a habit that as we approach the Bible, whether it's for personal study, devotional study, when you go to church and you listen to somebody preach, even tonight as you listen to me, you need to challenge everyone that you listen. You need to challenge yourself by reminding yourself, I am not Black Panther. I'm not the main character of this deal. Because I have said it before, if we perpetuate this mindset of meism, what's in for me, egocentric mindset in life and with God, two potential extremes will take place. One is pride, that you and I will develop or continue to develop this mindset that everybody owes me. Everybody owes me, including God. So I better, fill in the blank, or nothing wrong or nothing tragic happens to me. That's one extreme. The other extreme is self-pity. It's always defeat. It's I'm not worthy, I'm not good. Those two extremes of pridefulness and then self-pity and self-defeat, those are the result of making myself Black Panther in this whole film and movie. That's not how it works. The beauty of biblical interpretation, and this is why I'm bringing you into letter B on this letter to the Romans, is because he's using the word to the addressing the problem in Roman church. I don't like that language myself, because I'm not a confrontational guy. I don't like to confront problems, man. If I can avoid them, I will be the happiest. I will be more at peace with all of this. But apparently, Paul had no problem, confronting and dealing with these things. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't think that he was, or maybe he was, I don't know. But there's some people that just thrives into confrontation and they love conflict. That's fine. That's not my point. Here's my point. What I'm trying to tell you is that from the apostolic calling, leadership, overseeing, pastoral view, I think there's a sense of accountability that anybody that has been placed, and we're going to go through Timothy in just a second, and Timothy is going to, in Titus, they're going to break down this whole church structure, of elders and bishops and overseers. But the letter B to me is more of a sense of responsibility, that apparently, if you look at this problem between believing Jews and believing Gentiles, sometimes we don't make justice to the Bible, in a sense of our tendencies to sanitize the Bible, in a sense that we try to make it very, very healthy, very cohesive, very harmonious. And church has always been broken, dysfunctional, crazy, sinful, many times sinful. And that's because sinful people made up the church. That's exactly. Last week, there was a question coming out of John I'm talking about last Thursday, somebody asked a question from John 17, if the church is ever going to be one, as Jesus prayed in John 17. And I don't know if you remember Dr. Bob's answer, but the answer was, no, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And the reason why it's not going to happen, because you're a member of it and I'm a member of it. That's the reason, because you and I, we're just broken. That's who we are, right? I mean, we're just broken vessels. I'm sorry. This is not very uplifting message tonight. I'm not trying to put anybody down. I'm just telling you that Paul is dealing with that in Rome. And then this is what he says. This was probably a result of the expulsion of all Jews from Rome and their latter return. So again, historically, there is this kicking of the Jews out of Rome, and they're forced to be gone. Again, all this craziness in society, prejudice, racial, political issues. They're kicked out of it. Apparently, they were the ones leading the church prior to that incident. They're kicked out of Rome. They're kicked out of they have to leave the church. The Gentile community takes over in the leadership. Eventually, they're able to come back. And when they come back, they find the leadership being already in place, and they're not Jewish. So there's a conflict. By then, the Jewish Christian leaders had been replaced by Gentile Christian leaders. So if you are going through your church with some, misunderstanding and conflict, welcome to ministry. This is why Paul writes this letter. To introduce, letter C, to introduce himself to the Roman church, there was much opposition. Once again, look at this. On letter B, and I don't know if this is helpful. This is not very encouraging. On letter B, you have the word problem. On letter C, you have the word opposition to Paul from sincere converted Jews in Jerusalem, from insincere Jews, which are the Judaizers, and then from Gentiles, which are in the Colossians and Ephesians. Now, let me speak to you briefly about this. So apparently, Paul is dealing with three different kinds of groups, oppositional groups. Once again, the first one are those sincere converted Jews in Jerusalem. So this is quoted, this is coming from the Jerusalem Council on Acts chapter 15. This is what I will call internal problems. This is what I will call internal persecution. In the Bible, if you go through 1 Peter, which we are going to go through 1 Peter, in 2 weeks? Peter deals with persecution in the life of the church. Philippians deal with persecution in the life of the church internally, and eventually is going to be external. But a lot of these writings, they have to do with a sense of warning them for something that is either coming or maybe a current reality when it comes to persecution. So when you read on letter C that it has to do with, again, the sincere converted Jews in Jerusalem, that's more of an internal deal that is happening within the life of the church. Paul is dealing with them as an opposition. And then you go with the unsincere, this is at the end, unsincere Jews, which are the ones that are going to be found in the book of Galatians, 2 Corinthians, and some believe in the book of Philippians. And again, listen to this closely, because again, I've been talking about, the problem on letter B and then the opposition in letter C. Most of these letters are written in the context of a legal, what's the word that I'm looking for? Legal confrontation. Like if you picture a courtroom and they're confronting, there is a legal defense that is taking place. So keep that in mind when you read, Judaizers, that they're the unsincere Jewish people. And then the last one, which is the ones that he's going to write against in the book of Colossians and Ephesians, are those Gentiles, which we call them, or we know them as Gnostic or Gnosticism. So anyway, so again, he is, I guess, the reputation that Paul has been built or created. It is no accident. If you read, and I'm going to go back into this, if you read all these letters that you see on the screen, which are the 13 letters attributed to Paul, apparently Philippians, which is a letter that he describes with a lot of love, a lot of caring. The church in Philippi is the only letter apparently where he feels comfortable asking for money. Because in the letters to the Corinthians, they're going to accuse him that he was a money hunger. He was a prosperity gospel type of guy. And I'm bringing this up because in the letter to the Philippians, apparently is the only letter where he does not feel or does not see the need to defend and clarify that he is an apostle called by Jesus Christ. Read the introduction of every letter that he wrote. And he's always talking about, Paul, apostle of Jesus Christ, call to the Gentiles or whatever. And that's basically a defense. He's defending his apostleship. The last one is letter D. He was accused of being a dangerous innovator, adding recklessly to Jesus's teaching. And I don't know if you remember this from Dr. Bob's last week, but he made reference how, and this is how he began last week. Again, I don't know if you remember this, but if you were not in class last week, you got to go back and watch the video, which I put it on the email. But basically, it is understanding that the epistles, not just Paul, but the epistles, what they do, they expand on the teachings of Jesus. I personally believe that the epistles also what they do, and I'm bringing this up because of letter D. See, and letter D says he was accused of being a dangerous innovator, adding recklessly to Jesus' teaching. Now, my question to you, and I'd like for you to open your mics on this question. I'd like to hear from you. Why would you, like if I were to ask you to sit on this audience, on this recipient, which in this case is the church in Rome, if you were a member of this church, why would you think or believe that Paul was perceived as someone who was adding recklessly to Jesus' teaching? Talk to me. What will be some things that you will say, well, when Paul said that sounds like he's adding to the teachings of Christ. Anybody, talk to me.
I think one of the things is that Paul is very kind of doctrinal. He's very logical. He's very systematic. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the Gospels, there's very little systematic teaching from Jesus, which you could kind of write systematic theology on. You can do it quite easily based on Romans. Exactly. So I think if you put it this way, Jesus' teaching is very much based on implied knowledge, which we all kind of stuff we all know, and and I know, and let's just clarify what is there really to be said on one level when it is anything straight teaching, and then there's a lot of teaching via parables, but there's very little from scratch up. These are the baselines, and then we're building on the baselines. And Romans, of course, is very different in that sense. It is a letter which doesn't expect much. It doesn't suppose that there's an awful lot of pre-knowledge, and so it builds up a building of doctrine, and it seems to make it very popular in the
definitely
in the kind of for among theologians, while the Gospels become much harder to write a systematic theology on, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And you reminded me right now, and let me come back to the commentary. You're reminding me because on letter C, we said that he is basically introducing himself to the church, to the Roman church, and he finds the need, or he senses the need to introduce himself apparently from the understanding of clarification, like apparently, in this time in history or across the known world, and where the churches were, either being planted or growing, there is this reputation that Paul is losing a lot of followers in social media, because he is being labeled as a reckless, adding recklessly to the teachings of Jesus. And it is no wonder, because on letter C, I just gave you, or Dr. Bob is giving you, 3 different groups that they are on a mission to, in other words, I see a lot of opposition against Jesus's, ministry, but apparently Paul increased in opposition. He experienced, again, a lot of this opposition more directly and more. So anyway, so I guess part of that is the concept that he's being perceived as a dangerous innovator against these things. Now, sometimes I feel more comfortable if I knew that these letters were written, to the Roman government, to, Greek philosophers, to the barbarians, to, all these non-Jewish groups. But just like the Old Testament written primarily for the people of God, these letters are written for the church. And what I'm saying is that when he finds the need to explain, to clarify himself, to defend his theology, his ministry, his character assassination, I think the thing that just kills me is that it is within the church. Is within the church. And that is so, it's so hard for me to read this. And part of it is because we love the church. We love the church. And I think as pastors, and I'm just going to speak as a pastor, as pastors, we make the mistake sometimes to love the ideal church instead of loving the real church. One of the distinctiveness of these brothers, and this has to do with their calling, their authority as apostles, it's very obvious that they love the real church without condoning what the church was doing. Well, anyways, the thing is, again, he's labeled as someone who is recklessly adding to Jesus' teaching. The book of Romans was his way of systematically, and Peter, you just brought up some of that into the conversation, systematically defending himself by showing how, here, this is huge, how the gospel or his gospel was true. How did he do that? Well, he did that by using the Old Testament and the teachings of Jesus, which is definitely the fulfillment of that gospel. Anyway, so again, this is a huge statement within the concept of clarifying these things. All right, I need to move to the next book. Any questions up to here? Any questions on the questions that you were supposed to answer from Romans? Any comments? Somebody talk to me. Are you guys okay?
Vidal, I think that just in response to your initial question that you posed, that Julius responded to, I think that if my feeling is that from the question you just asked, I get the feeling that the answer to that might be sort of something like what Bob would say. Well, just because you never heard it before doesn't mean that I'm weird. You may be weird. I just kind of get the impression that when you said, why would he ask, why would you ask this kind of question? I just get the impression that either the brothers who'd started off the church and had carried the church on in Rome had misunderstood what the biblical gospel was, and were teaching something that wasn't really in line with what Paul actually meant when he said what he said. And obviously he's dealing with two groups. He's dealing with Jews and he's dealing with Gentiles. So, this is the issue that some people have with Paul's letter to the Romans. It's not, we're Western people, so we're going to be theologically oriented, details oriented people. But the Jews, generally speaking, the Jews didn't do theology. They did Torah. They did the law. So he's dealing with that, and you can see it from chapter 2 and chapter 3, where he starts dealing with the issues of righteousness and law and works and things like of that nature. But in chapter 1, of course, he deals with the paganistic nature of the Gentiles as well. And of course, they're coming from a completely different world as well. You can see how easily the Jews and the Gentiles got mixed up and misunderstood Paul. You can see why he says what he says, because they're two completely different worldviews, two completely different cultures, and it's easy to see how it's easy to see why Paul was saying what he was saying when he specifically addresses both the issues around the Jews and circumcision and law versus works, and the Gentiles of calls with the pagan lifestyle, which he addresses in Romans 1, specifically.
Well, and you're reminding me right now that the common denominator that you find in the Old Testament for the prophets when they are called to exercise their calling, to exercise, what God has called them to be and do, and then the apostles in the New Testament, I find this common denominator. I find that the people of God, Old Testament, the Israelites, New Testament, the church as a whole, I think both groups, they have this one thing in common, which I think is what we have in common today in church across the world, is that I think the church embraces and believes on what Jesus said and who Jesus is, as long as we have and keep or perpetuate the freedom to define what that means. So everybody starts keeping and building their own version of Jesus.
Do it our way.
Exactly. We create multiple, and part of it, to a certain degree, is unavoidable because our cultural lenses, because of our previous experiences, because of how we were raised, and our way of life, and again, just because that's who we are. And this is why, when we get to the book of Acts, which is in 2 weeks, we're going to spend some time, and I'm going to email you the article. And I'm going to email you the video because Dr. Bob made a presentation fairly recent, and he actually has 2 sermons. I know he tried to build kind of the series, but in the book of Acts, you have the kerygma, which is the preaching of the apostles. And there are the sermons that the book of Acts is going to, again, the historian, Luke the historian, which we attribute that as the author, he sees the need to record, to document those sermons. And here's my point. My point is that our church here in South Texas, every summer we do an emphasis, and I say summer, but it begins in the middle of May all the way to the middle of August, which is kind of our summer. And we do an emphasis on what we have called for now several years, World Mandate, which is an emphasis on missions. And about 2 years ago, we make the effort to remind ourselves that as much, and we, by the way, missions meaning we mobilize people and people go to the nations to serve, to do ministry in so many ways. But my point is this, as important as it is the gospel presentation, evangelism and all that, we wanted to make sure, and this is what we did about 2 years ago, and that was the series, because I preached an entire series of the summer just with that topic of world mandate. I preached all 8 sermons, I think there are 8, if I'm not mistaken, all 8 sermons in the book of Acts from the apostles. And this is the point. The point was that as we share the gospel, as we bring Jesus into the nations, the meaning of that gospel is the authoritative voice of the apostles. In other words, people coming to know Christ, people embracing Jesus, finding salvation is not the goal. That's the beginning. That's the entry point. The goal is put yourself, put the church, put the pastor, put the leadership under the authority of what the apostles said and what the apostles meant. And I think that's where those sermons come into place. And that's exactly why these letters are extremely important. Because once the family, the Christian, divorces what Jesus said from what Jesus meant, or the application of the words of Jesus, you're asking for trouble. You're asking for all this confusion that I think that was what was going on in the Old Testament, that was going on then in the New Testament, and the price to pay for this men, for this women, the price to pay to bring them back together, the words and the meaning of Jesus, the price to pay was their own lives. That was a price to pay because of the opposition. Because as I speak to you today, it's not popular. It's not popular for the message of Jesus to say, I'm glad that you are avoiding hell. I'm glad that you're finding, eternal life in Jesus. But the win is not heaven when you die. The win is Christ's likeness while you are on
Yeah.
earth.
Yeah.
And let me tell you what that means. And typically, that's not how we preach the gospel. That's not how we typically structure the church. That's not typically how we do life. Anyway, I think that's part of the reason why this is so crucial when we read these books and we look at this. All right, I got to move on, guys. And I know we're not going to finish everything on this, but let me just take you briefly to the book of Thessalonians. I'm not gonna be able to do both letters of Thessalonians, but I will try to cover some of them. So one more time, share the screen. Are you guys with me? Are you guys seeing my screen? Are you guys seeing
Yes.
Thessalonians? Are you still seeing it right here? Yeah? Okay, good.
No.
You're not seeing it.
No. I could just see a couple
Okay.
of open windows.
Okay, hold on. Are you seeing it now?
Seeing the screen, but not the document.
Not the document. Okay, all right. That's my fault. How about now?
There we go.
Here we go. Yep.
There is Thessalonians. Hello, Thessalonians. All right. So same thing, okay? Brief summary, that's important. Again, it's giving you the overview, the Classes New Testament survey overview. The Thessalonian letters provide tremendous insight into Paul as both missionary and pastor. Huge statement, okay? Huge statement because, look at this, missionary and pastor. We find him establishing a church in a brief time and continuing to pray and be concerned about, again, as a pastor, overseer, as a shepherd, as an apostle, he's concerned about the growth, the development in the ministry. Now, one of the things that I want to remind you guys, and again, we are so bad. I mean, we are so bad in sanitizing the Bible. We take away all the drama and the craziness and the brokenness. And I'm saying this because when Dr. Bob speaks of Paul's concern about its growth, development, and ministry, I don't believe that he's implying that Paul is simply hoping that the church is going to grow and develop and do ministry. I think what is implied because of the brokenness of the church is that the church was not growing, that the church was not developing towards Christ's likeness. In other words, these churches, because there are occasional letters, they're dealing with the specific issues that is taking the church in opposite direction. Does that make sense? Versus most of the time we are so driven by morality versus the aggressiveness of the gospel that we, without saying it, we typically believe that everybody's good, everybody's okay, that there is no big deal on what's happening today. Where Paul in Romans is going to give us this humongous statement of depravity and the condition of men. Anyways, so I want you to keep that in mind when you read these introductions. Number 2, we see him, Paul, faithfully proclaiming the gospel, concern for the converts, scolding them, praising them, guiding them, exhorting them, teaching them, loving them, and even giving of himself to them. Again, I want you to read that whole statement through the lenses of his missionary and pastoral heart. And again, let me speak to churches right now. And this is not fair because as a pastor, you may feel or think that I'm just I guess I'm just ventilating my frustration, and I might be, I don't know. But as a pastor, one of the most difficult things that we pastors find, just going back to what we just read, is when the church doesn't allow you as a pastor, as a shepherd, to protect them, to shepherd them, to guide them. So in my mind, I go back into this image that I think that we are seeing through Paul, in a sense of that parental leadership, protection, guidance. So the question that I typically ask churches, and we need to wrestle with this, is conceptually, we agree on the call of a pastor, on the role of a pastor. We doctrinally typically agree on what the function of a pastor is and the qualifications. The challenge is that from that concept, theology, doctrine, sometimes there is a big gap between that and the actual exercising, structuring systems within the life of the church that allows for those things to take place. And I think this is where statistically 16, listen, statistically 16,000 pastors leave the ministry, leave the churches per year in the United States. And I think that has to do a lot with that not being allowed to shepherd to do. Now, obviously, it's a two-way conversation, and pastors, we gotta do, and we're called to do a better job, exercising those things. But anyways, let me just finish this. So he was thrilled with their progress. I'm right here in the middle. He was thrilled with the progress to that point, but was disappointed with the rate at which they were maturing. So again, maturity, right? Maturity is supposed to just be an overflow, a result of walking in Christ likeness. And that wasn't happening, apparently. In these epistles, we meet a zealous, loving servant of Christ in a small, zealous but growing new church. Both were faithful, both were used by God, and both served each other in Christ-like manner, seldom found among God's people. Then he describes a little bit of the city of Thessalonica, which again has to do with the recipients. Well, he spends a lot of time on that. The author, obviously speaking of Paul and describing Paul on that regard. And then, again, look at the list. This is the list that I've been telling you, and how, Dr. Bob, this is so helpful just for muscle memory. If we can if we can memorize this, somehow this is so helpful. It's been so helpful for me. The events that were taking place historically, just for context purposes, and then the purpose of the letters. That's the section that I typically ask you to look at carefully. So briefly, just the purpose of the letter. Why did he write this letter? The Thessalonian letters have a threefold purpose. Here we go. Number one is to share Paul's joy and thanksgiving to God for the faithfulness and Christ-likeness of these Thessalonians, even amidst persecution. So that's a huge statement. He's sensing, again, as a father finds joy in the success of a child, in the beauty of blessedness in the life of a family. I think that's exactly the tone, the undercurrent that is happening. Number two is to answer the criticism of his motives and character, which he had been brought against him. Make the connection with what we just read in Romans, right? From every angle, he's been crucified. Character assassination, questioning his calling, his motives. So he finds the need always to defend himself. Number three is to discuss the return of the Lord. I don't know if you guys remember this, but this is one of the main points that is happening within the letters of Thessalonians. There's a lot of confusion, apparently, among these churches, these house churches, when it comes to the return of Jesus. This eschatological element of Paul's preaching caused two questions in the minds of the Christians in Thessalonica. Here are the questions. As you preach through this letter, you're going to keep this in mind. What would happen to believers who had died before the Lord's return? One more time. What would happen to believers who have died before the return of Jesus? Now, I don't know if you're getting the point here, but it seems to me that it's pretty obvious that this generation of Christians, this first generation of Christians or second generation of Christians, they believed, just like you and I believed, that Jesus was coming back in their time. My question to you is this, and again, I want you to open your mics for my question. Are we wrong by believing that Jesus can come back anytime this week, this month? Is that a right belief, positive belief, or we should believe otherwise? What do you guys think when we affirm Jesus' return?
This is a squirrely sort of question that can probably cause more unclarity than actual clarity sometimes. It's kind of like the Trinity. It's best described by what it isn't rather than what it is. But I think that if you subscribe to the Eastern concept of time, which is cyclical,
mm-hmm.
In other words, you start at this point and you're always moving forward, but you're going in a circle until you return to that same point. I think that's the Eastern the ancient Near Eastern worldview of time, whereas Western time it's linear. You know, you start from point A, you move forward to point B, and you're always moving forward, and you can't go backwards. I think it's, if you subscribe to the concept of the now but not yet, because it's certainly true that the apostles believed that Christ was returning in their day, right? And you know, you get into the interpretation of the day of the Lord, which is, it's mentioned in the Old Testament, but it's also referred to in the New, and we need to be careful nuancing that. I believe it's quite possible. I believe it's, if the Gospels can say that, in one particular Gospel, it says that not even the Son knows, only the Father knows when He's coming back. I've got a bit of amnesia at the moment. I should know the actual passage from the book. I think it's either Luke or Mark. I'm not sure, but if not even the Son knows, then it's something that's known only to the Father. But certainly God is all powerful enough to come back in 5 minutes' time, or to return in 5,000 years' time. We just don't know. We just don't know. In the Gospels, we're told specifically to be on our guard. You know, in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, be on your guard, keep watch, be vigilant. So, yeah, it's clearly they thought that. They believed that Christ was going to return in their time, in their generation.
You don't blame him for that, do they? Do you? You don't blame him for believing that?
I know.
So when you read this question about, because the question was, you know, what would happen to the believers who had died before the Lord's return? Apparently, they have this sense of imminent return in their generation.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and you're reminding me what you're saying right now, one of the things that, again, we do not make justice to the Bible or to the, and this is why the fifth of the questions on biblical interpretation has to do with the recipients, with the audience, right? I mean, it's a major factor in understanding, you know, biblical authority. And I'm going to make a very general statement, and it may be a little bit prejudiced, but I have to kind of make a clarification before I say that. But I come from a background that I haven't known suffering the way these brothers have known suffering. So if you're going through extreme suffering, which these churches are heading towards, internally and externally, persecution, you know, by confusion doctrinally, and then eventually being incarcerated and, you know, killed and murdered and all this kinds of stuff, I can see the reason why they hunger the return of Jesus. It makes perfect sense that they are speaking with a sense of desperation. Come, Lord Jesus. See, one of the things that we're going to see with Peter, we're going to get to Peter in 2 weeks, hopefully, is that Peter is reminding the church. See, this is what I said earlier, man. This is so hard to read, because a lot of these things that you find from the apostles, as we read them from the rear view mirror as a historical document, historical accounts, historical events, we read them and we're like, man, this makes perfect sense, but how come they didn't get it? And here's my point. Peter is reminding the church, or will remind the church when we get there, that when it comes to suffering, not only that it should be expected because it's a Genesis 3 world, so the closer you walk in Christ's likeness, the more that you're asking for being rejected and persecuted. It just goes hand in hand. And Peter is going to tell the church, this is the internal persecution of the church 2,000 years ago. Peter is going to tell the church, the problem with you guys is not simply that it's not that you're being surprised by suffering, because he keeps on saying, do not be surprised. But the problem is not that you are being surprised, but the bigger problem is that you guys have accommodated to the world. No wonder when you suffer, it's like, why am I suffering? Because your theology and your worldview has been camouflaged with this world's, environment and mindset and decision making. And so again, we don't promote suffering. We don't believe on the gospel of suffering. We don't believe that the more that you suffer, the closer that you are to Jesus. But if Jesus is the cornerstone and we are living stones by being united to Jesus, Peter also said that the cornerstone is the one that was rejected by men and was chosen by God. But the thing that we forget, or that we conveniently, again, disregard, is that the choosing of God, and if you want to use the word predestination, the way that God chose Jesus was exactly to be the suffering servant. He was chosen to be rejected. So the brokenness of the world, the rejection of the world, of that generation, they were simply the instruments that God, before the creation of the world, chose to fulfill God's redemptive plan. And all of that is given from the very beginning, and the church conveniently, naively, circumstantially disregarded, and they're confronted with the reality of internal suffering, a lot of confusion doctrinally, and eventually persecution, and they don't know what to do. And Peter is saying, what do you mean you don't know what to do? You were told what to do. You were told from the beginning how to navigate. This was coming your way. Why are you surprised? Anyways, that's a lot of frustration I can sense from these apostles, and yet it's a sense of frustration with this beautiful kind of a entertained with love and care and this, again, parental overseeing and shepherding of this generation 2,000 years ago, which I believe that's exactly what we're called to do today. All right. Anyways, let me just finish this, guys, because again, time is running out. And okay, you are able to see the screen. What would happen to the believers in the congregation who had stopped working and were sitting around waiting for the Lord's return? They were just waiting. I mean, come on. Some crazy theology was going on 2,000 years ago. Some things have never changed. Crazy theology. To answer specific questions asked by the church, you go into the reference that is there. Much of the above can be explained by the fact that this was a young and very zealous church, yet because of the circumstances, they were imperfectly trained and disciplined. I'm going to say that again. They were imperfectly trained. So keep in mind the sense of discipleship. This is a process of discipling, help them to walk in Christ likeness. These problems represent what would be expected of a church of this nature. Here's what was this nature: the new believer, the weak, the faint, heartened, the idle, the visionary, and the apostle. The occasion for 2 Thessalonians was, it is simply a second prescription for the same case made after discovering that certain stubborn symptoms had not yielded to the first treatment. So, this is a reference from this author, Walker, that Dr. Bob is making. And again, he gives you the bibliography of all the sources where he's quoting and he's bringing this information. All right. Questions, guys, up to here. Any questions, comments? Give me 5 more minutes and let me just cover one more book and then we will be done. Any questions, comments? You guys okay? Everybody good? So far, so good? Let me take you into another letter, which in this case is the letter of 1 Timothy. All right. Do you guys see the letter? Do you guys see the commentary?
Yeah.
Everybody?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to take you straight into the bottom. Again, here is again the chronology. Helpful. Very, very helpful. Let's memorize that. Really helps. Here's the occasion and the purpose, okay, for Timothy. And I want you to see some of these are going to overlap between the first letter and the second letter, and even Titus, but specifically the Timothy letters. Okay, so keep this in mind. The main purpose was, here's the main purpose. Here's the main reason why he wrote these letters, is to bring a rebuttal, to fight against, to combat emerging heresies that were happening. I mean, it's happening. 1 Timothy 1, verses 3 through 7. The specific heresy may be a combination of Jewish and Gnostic tendencies. So here's where you get this mixture. This is where you see, I mean, once again, once you negotiate the non-negotiable, anything can happen. So once again, what you have today, based on some studies that were recently made, what you have today in churches across the United States of America and probably around the world as well, is what is called the deistic moralistic therapeutic deism. Moralistic therapeutic deism, which is nothing else but basically a mixture of God and the version of what accommodates to me of the same God. So I'm all for God as long as he fulfills what I think I need. So the concept of therapeutic moralistic deism is the understanding that there is a God. I believe that there is a God, so I'm a deist. I believe there is a God, but again, not necessarily holy or righteous. Not necessarily somebody that demands holiness or righteousness, and especially not necessarily somebody that has provided the righteous one or the justifier. So that implies that since there is a God, he exists for my well-being, for my safety, for my protection. So if I come to Jesus, is to have or accomplish the American dream or whatever the dream I'm trying to accomplish. And then the moralistic, the therapeutic is because there is no sin. I mean, the only sin that there is for me to say that there is sin. But, everybody's cool. Your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. What's the big deal? So that implies that when I go through a difficulty, a challenge, I just need a coach, a therapist. I just need somebody to help me out. Well, that's exactly what has been inundated in the church today, and we are in big trouble. The specific heresy may be a combination, again, of Jewish and Gnostic tendencies, much like the false teachers found in Ephesians and Colossians, a lot of Gnosticism. Possibly there were two distinct groups. Letter B, the Old Testament gives specific guidelines for the organization of the community of faith. Watch this, please. The Old Testament gives specific guidelines on how to organize communities of faith. In contrast, the New Testament does not contain specific instructions concerning the organization or the polity, meaning the government of the church. So these pastoral letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, are as close as it comes to New Testament guidelines. And I'm going to say this again. To me, this is a very sensitive, close to my heart issue, because I'll just give you a quick example. In the book of Romans, chapter 12, you find a list of gifts. And I know last week there was a conversation over the gifts, from the book of Ephesians and then Corinthians and all that. In the book of Romans, Paul is going to describe and going to list some of these gifts. And one of them, which I don't remember the verse, I think is verse 8, 7, maybe, I don't know. But it's in Romans 12, which, by the way, Romans is the practical section of the book. The first 11 chapters are we call the indicative, the theological, the in-depth, the character of God, character of Jesus. And then from 12 until 16, or maybe 15, is basically, this is what you do with everything that I just gave you. So within the practical, he discusses and he presents or introduces or reminds the church that leadership is a gift. It's a gift, like the other gifts. And here's my point. When I read this from 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, on being the closest to a structure in the church in a manner that, is the closest as the Bible instructs, to me is so important, because if leadership is a gift, the question that I have for the church, the question that I have for pastors is the church being a structure? Is the system in the church a system that allows for these gifts to flourish? That will be my question. Because again, I think the church conceptually, doctrinally, philosophically, there is a lot of agreement. But when it comes to the actual incarnation, exercising crystallization of those doctrines and things like that, that's where I believe the church struggles. And I think that's where you get in situations where potentially pastors may leave the church. I said earlier that about 16,000 pastors leave churches in the United States, and some of them will leave the church because of moral issues, which unfortunately happens, but the majority is because the structure of the church does not allow for shepherds to shepherd, for leaders to lead. And again, I'm just speaking of a common denominator that typically happens in here. Letter C, Timothy was written to request Timothy to stay on at Ephesus, to deal with the false teachers, and to organize leadership. Okay, 3 things quickly. Requesting for him to stay in Ephesus, again, as an extension of the apostolic leadership. And this leadership was needed because the church had false teachers and it had bad leadership. Now, let me ask you this question. Would you agree that false teaching with bad leadership, they're the perfect storm? I mean, you're asking for disaster. You're asking for trouble. So here's my point, and then we're going to pray after this. Aren't you glad when you see all these details and those realities, which are not very, very, very encouraging sometimes? Would you agree that if 2,000 years later, you and I are here and we're a part of the church, it's not because of the church, but it's in spite of the church? It's not because the church had or has perfect theology. It's not because the church is, figure things out, but is in spite of, again, bad doctrine and poor leadership and things like that. And again, I'm not promoting nor condoning, false teaching or bad, leadership. I think we need to deal with those issues. But I just want to remind ourselves tonight that 100 years from now, the next generation and the generations to come, if Jesus hasn't returned, they will be in good hands because of God's covenantal promises, not because of our eagerness for evangelism. And I'm not taking anything away from the church and the efforts that we're trying to do and the good that we have made and do for the kingdom of God. So I'm not taking anything away from Timothy and Paul, anything like that. But this is where I go back into Genesis chapter 15, where God makes these promises. I go back to Genesis 3:15 and 16. This messianic promises, and this is the hope that we find in our conversation tonight. It's just the reminder that as beautiful as the church is, and is beautiful, and we give our lives for the church, we are devoted to serve and to love Jesus and his bride. Again, the focus, the promise, again, the Black Panther is not the church, it's not the people of God, it's literally Jesus. That's the hope. That's the centrality of everything that we have said tonight.